This prison once stood as a scientific experiment, not to rehabilitate people, but to break them. What happened inside was so disturbing that officials didn't just shut it down, they tried to erase it from history. No records, no accountability, only silence. To understand why this prison had to be erased, we first need to understand why it was built at all. Because this place was never meant to be ordinary. It was designed as an experiment that would quietly spiral out of control. In the early 19th century, prisons were overflowing. Crime was rising, cities were expanding, and governments were desperate for solutions. Punishment alone was no longer seen as enough. They wanted reform, they wanted obedience, and most importantly, they wanted control. That's when a radical idea began to spread. What if criminals could be fixed, not through violence, but through isolation? The belief was simple. Remove all outside influence. No other prisoners, no conversation, no human contact, just silence. Authorities believed that total isolation would force inmates to confront their own conscience, that solitude would lead to reflection, and reflection would lead to repentance. On paper, it sounded humane, almost enlightened. This philosophy became known as the separate system, and one prison would be built entirely around it. Every corridor, every cell, every routine, designed to keep prisoners alone, day and night. Each inmate was placed in a single cell. They worked alone, ate alone, and slept alone. Even when they left their cells, their faces were covered, so they could not see or be seen by anyone else. Guards were instructed to speak as little as possible. Human interaction was considered a weakness. Silence was the treatment. At first, officials praised the results. Visitors described the prison as calm, orderly, almost peaceful. But beneath that calm surface, something was already beginning to go wrong. Because the human mind was never meant to exist in total isolation, and the people running this experiment were about to learn that the hard way. At first, the silence seemed to work. Prison records described inmates as calm, compliant, focused. But those reports didn't tell the full story. Within weeks, guards began noticing small changes. Men staring at walls for hours, whispering to themselves, losing track of time. Some inmates stopped responding when spoken to. Others begged guards for any kind of interaction, a word, a sound, a voice. Medical staff started filing quiet notes. Insomnia, anxiety, hallucinations. Prisoners reported hearing footsteps that weren't there, voices coming from empty corridors. For some, the silence became unbearable. Several inmates began harming themselves, not to escape, but to feel something. Officials dismissed these incidents as weakness. They insisted the system was working as intended. The goal was obedience, and obedience was being achieved. But something else was happening. The prisoners weren't being reformed, they were breaking. Cells that were meant for reflection became places of psychological collapse. And the longer the isolation continued, the worse the effects became. Yet the experiment continued, because admitting failure would have meant admitting responsibility. As months turned into years, The effects of the isolation became impossible to hide, even within the tightly controlled environment of the prison, where officials had every incentive to downplay what was happening behind the cell doors. Medical reports grew longer, more detailed, and increasingly difficult to dismiss as coincidence, describing prisoners who no longer recognized the passage of time, who struggled to remember their own names, and who reacted with panic or aggression to even the smallest disruptions in their routine. Some inmates developed severe paranoia, convinced that guards were watching them constantly, while others believed they were being punished for crimes they could no longer remember committing. Hallucinations became common, with prisoners reporting voices that spoke from inside the walls, footsteps echoing through empty corridors, and shadows moving in cells that were otherwise completely still. In several documented cases, inmates began speaking to objects, holding conversations with furniture, or repeating the same phrases for hours at a time, as if language itself was slowly unraveling in the absence of human contact. Guards, many of whom initially supported the system, began expressing concern in private, admitting that they were witnessing changes that went beyond discipline or punishment and crossed into something far more disturbing. Some officers requested transfers, unable to continue working in an environment where silence felt oppressive and where the mental deterioration of prisoners unfolded day after day without intervention. Outside the prison walls, word began to spread among doctors, reformers, and politicians, many of whom were initially enthusiastic supporters of the experiment, but were now questioning whether total isolation could ever be considered humane. Visiting inspectors documented prisoners who covered their ears to block out imaginary sounds, others who refused to leave their cells out of fear, and some who collapsed emotionally when faced with even brief moments of social interaction. Instead of producing remorse and rehabilitation, the system appeared to be dismantling the human psyche piece by piece, leaving behind individuals who were incapable of functioning outside the narrow confines of their cells. Still, the administration resisted change, arguing that the breakdowns were rare, exaggerated, or the result of pre-existing conditions rather than the isolation itself, despite mounting evidence to the contrary. But the warnings were no longer coming from a single source. They were coming from doctors, guards, inspectors, and even former supporters of the system, all describing the same pattern of psychological collapse. And for the first time, the question was no longer whether the experiment was effective. It was whether it had gone too far to be stopped quietly. Eventually, the effects of the isolation were no longer confined to internal reports and whispered conversations among guards, because the consequences of the experiment began spilling beyond the prison walls and into the public eye. Former inmates who were released back into society struggled to function in even the most basic social situations, many unable to maintain eye contact, hold conversations, or tolerate crowded spaces after years of enforced solitude. Doctors outside the prison began documenting these cases, describing men who displayed severe anxiety, emotional numbness, and long-lasting psychological damage that could not be explained by imprisonment alone. Journalists and prison reform advocates took notice, questioning how a system that claimed to be humane could leave such visible scars on those subjected to it. Public criticism grew steadily, fueled by testimonies from former prisoners, leaked medical observations, and accounts from guards who finally spoke out after leaving their posts. What disturbed critics most was not just the suffering itself, but the deliberate structure behind it, a system designed to isolate individuals so completely that their sense of identity slowly deteriorated without physical violence ever being used. Political pressure followed, as lawmakers were forced to confront uncomfortable questions about accountability, ethics, and whether the state had knowingly sanctioned psychological harm in the name of reform. Official inspections were ordered, and for the first time, external investigators were granted access to observe conditions that had previously been shielded from meaningful oversight. Their findings were deeply unsettling, documenting prisoners who reacted with fear or confusion to human voices, others who showed signs of severe depression, and some who had become emotionally detached to the point of near catatonia. Reports concluded that prolonged isolation did not lead to rehabilitation, but instead produced long-term mental damage that often worsened rather than improved over time. Despite these conclusions, the prison's administration remained defensive, arguing that any failures were isolated incidents rather than the result of a fundamentally flawed system. Behind closed doors, however, confidence in the experiment was collapsing as officials realized that the growing body of evidence could no longer be dismissed or controlled. The question was no longer whether the system was controversial. It was whether continuing it would result in consequences that could no longer be contained. And with public scrutiny intensifying, the fate of the prison was approaching a turning point that could not be delayed much longer. The decision to close the prison did not come with a public announcement or a clear explanation, because by the time authorities finally acted, the situation had become too complicated and too damaging to address openly. There was no dramatic trial, no televised hearings, and no official admission of failure. Only a series of quiet administrative decisions that gradually dismantled the institution from the inside out. Transfers began without warning, with inmates moved to other facilities under the cover of routine reassignments, while staff were instructed to treat the process as confidential and avoid discussing it beyond their immediate superiors. Cells that had once held prisoners for years at a time were emptied, sealed, and left untouched, as if freezing the space itself could prevent questions from being asked about what had occurred within those walls. Records related to the experiment were archived, restricted, or quietly removed from public access, making it increasingly difficult for outsiders to reconstruct a complete picture of how the system had operated and why it had failed so thoroughly. Officials framed the closure as a logistical necessity rather than a moral reckoning, citing costs, outdated infrastructure, or administrative restructuring, while carefully avoiding any mention of psychological harm or long-term damage. For many of those involved, the goal was not accountability but containment, limiting the narrative before it could develop into a full-scale scandal that might expose years of unethical decision-making. The prison itself was left standing, but stripped of its purpose, its corridors empty and silent once more, not as a monument to reform, but as an uncomfortable reminder of an experiment that had gone too far. Former prisoners were released back into society or absorbed into other institutions, often without adequate support, carrying the lasting effects of isolation into lives that were already fractured. Guards and administrators moved on as well, reassigned or promoted, their involvement fading into bureaucracy as responsibility became increasingly difficult to trace. In the absence of public reckoning, the story of the prison began to dissolve, existing only in fragments, scattered across restricted documents, personal memories, and second-hand accounts. What remained was not closure, but silence. A silence that would soon become deliberate. After the prison was shut down, something unusual began to happen, not through dramatic action, but through quiet omission, as references to the institution slowly disappeared from official narratives and public records. Documents that once detailed daily operations, inmate numbers, and medical observations became increasingly difficult to locate, either reclassified, archived under vague headings, or removed entirely from accessible databases. Public reports that had previously mentioned the prison were revised or reissued without reference to the experiment, leaving gaps in timelines that were never formally explained. Maps and planning documents were altered, minimizing the prison's presence or omitting it altogether, as if its physical existence alone posed a reputational risk. Requests for information were met with vague responses, citing lost files, incomplete archives, or jurisdictional limitations that made accountability nearly impossible to trace. Former officials avoided discussing their involvement, while institutions responsible for oversight deflected responsibility, each pointing elsewhere when questions arose. Over time, the story fragmented, surviving only in academic footnotes, personal letters, and the memories of those directly affected, none of which were ever assembled into an official account. The absence of a clear narrative served a purpose, because without documentation, there could be no investigation, and without investigation, there could be no consequences. What replaced the truth was not denial, but ambiguity, a strategy far more effective at dulling public interest and preventing sustained scrutiny. Generations passed with little awareness that such an experiment had ever taken place, its lessons unlearned, and its victims largely forgotten. The prison remained physically present for a time, but without context or explanation, eventually rebranded, repurposed, or reduced to a historical footnote stripped of its original meaning. In this way, the erasure was never complete, but it was sufficient, transforming a documented failure into a vague and uncomfortable memory that few were encouraged to explore. And in the absence of memory, the system that allowed it to happen was free to repeat itself elsewhere. What makes this story unsettling is not just what happened inside the prison, but how easily it faded from public consciousness once it became inconvenient to remember. There was no dramatic reckoning, no public apology, and no clear line drawn between those who designed the system and those who suffered under it. Instead, the experiment ended quietly, its failures absorbed into bureaucracy, its consequences scattered across forgotten documents and damaged lives. This matters because the principles behind the experiment did not disappear with the prison. Isolation is still used today, often justified as necessary, temporary, or controlled, despite decades of evidence showing its profound psychological effects. Modern institutions continue to debate its effectiveness, frequently separating policy from consequence in much the same way this prison once did. When systems prioritize order over humanity, harm does not always arrive violently. Sometimes it arrives slowly, wrapped in procedure, justified by good intentions, and protected by silence. The erasure of this prison serves as a warning, not because it was uniquely cruel, but because it was disturbingly ordinary, built by people who believed they were doing the right thing. Remembering what happened is not about assigning blame to the past, but about recognizing how easily harm can be repeated when accountability is avoided. History does not always disappear on its own. Sometimes it is removed deliberately. And when uncomfortable truths are erased, the conditions that allowed them to exist remain, waiting, ready to return.